Okay, welcome to our quarterly technical exchange webinar for our Jacobs Pipeline Condition Assessment and Rehabilitation Services Community of Practice. This quarter will be our summer presentation. The presenters today are myself, talking about our rehabilitation project, and Dan Hagwold will be talking about our CARS field services. Before I get started, I wanted to share quick to everybody that we've moved to a new platform for these. You're still watching this through MS Teams, but to get your PDH credits, be sure to enroll for the course through Net Dimensions. So just a quick announcement, Jacobs has moved to this Net Dimensions platform for all of the training that the COPs are doing. It's very similar to some of the onboarding training that you guys did or likely have done. And what that means is that a recording of this webinar will be posted in that portal. You can get to Net Dimensions through the Jacobs Connect website, and you can view the recording on demand. And then get PDHs for it on demand as well. So for our practitioners who aren't able to join this actual call, they can always go and find the course through Net Dimensions, watch it, and then collect their PDHs afterwards. In this day and age, I think that's a great new feature. And so I just wanted to share that with folks in case they have to drop off or want to come back. There's still an opportunity for you to watch the full webinar in its entirety and earn PDHs later on. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started with this first half of the webinar. So the title of this project or case study was Alternative Delivery Enables a Slip Burst Ram Project for 72-inch Pipeline Rehabilitation. And so I'll be talking about that, explaining what we mean, but this was a fun project to do and kind of the first of its kind that we got to do for this customer. So quick background, our agenda will be talking about some background of the project. We'll go through the condition assessment of the pipeline and what drove us to the rehabilitation need. Talk about alternatives analysis. We'll explain the CMGC alternative delivery model that we ended up following. Talk a little bit about the technical details for rehabilitation design, show some eye candy for construction, and then move into lessons learned. So the Incline Creek Culvert is our subject here. It's about 2,000 feet of 72-inch corrugated metal pipe. It's a stream. It was a stream culvert. So we don't have exact records, but I believe it was installed in the 1970s. And you can see the alignment here, kind of from a perspective. Top side, the culvert, the full culvert alignment is shown in that yellow line there. It's all buried. You can see a couple of photographs. One at the bottom of the screen there shows what the entrance to the culvert looks like. You can see how deep it is, the embankment on top of it. And then that picture in the upper right shows kind of the ski lodge that's been built on top of it, and the culvert passes alongside and underneath it. Our understanding is the most probable construction method was that this was a creek that they just rolled the CMP into and then bulldozed over, kind of caved in the sides of the creek on top of it, which is probably one of the reasons that led to its observed condition and need for rehab. So as you can see, it passes under a ski lodge, chairlift towers, and access roads. And we first got involved in this project in 2011, and we actually saw invert erosion, very common, buckled sections, extreme ovality, and trench piping, that's the term used to say that fine materials are eroded from the outside of the pipe, and they erode that haunch support and get carried away by the waste stream. And then even in 2017, sinkholes and failures appeared, which accelerated the schedule for renewal and moved into condition assessment. I do see a couple hands raised. We'll have time for questions at the end, but just to make sure that I can get through all the content, and since this is being recorded, we can always come back and ask questions as we move along. So the full recording will be available for the team. So some pictures of the initial CCTV investigation. You can see buckled sections with reverse curvature, some oblique ovality. This is what I meant by one of those results of just caving in the side of the trench and kind of deforming the pipe. We see invert erosion.
Hey Dan, this is Rajat. We can't see the screen.
No, can anybody on the call see the screen right now?
Dan, this is Kenny. I can see it.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yes. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I apologize if people can't see the screen. The whole meeting is being recorded, so I do apologize. I would totally understand if you wish to drop off since you can't see it and view the recording later. But I'm aware that this sometimes happens with Teams, but it's not something that I fix. It's more of a tech support issue. This has happened on some of the other practice calls before. So So I'll go ahead and keep rolling, and like I said, it is recorded, so you will be able to watch all of it later on demand as you'd like. So this other photograph that I have here in the bottom left shows invert erosion with soil piping. So you can see where actually the bottom of the culvert was scraped away, right, and then that soil support was eroded and washed away. And then the picture on the lower right is an isolated lifted portion. So that's where we've actually got pieces of it that get, that got either lifted up and broken away from the invert. So a problem with the culvert there. So this was characterized, something that I want to share with our practice, unlike reinforced concrete pipe or other flexible pipes, CMP can actually deflect a lot before it buckles. I mean, even greater than 10, much greater than 10% sometimes. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the ovality itself may not be a cause for immediate rehabilitation for CMP. If it buckles, it certainly does. But what this does do to you is when you do have that extreme mobility, then you kind of exceed your conventional rehab methods, because although the culvert might not be an immediate threat of collapsing on itself just due to ovality, there's very little that you can do to fix it and reimpart any structural strength. A lot of the rehab technologies need a certain amount of base ovality. Deflecting CMP likely indicates soil failure, right? It's a flexible pipe, which means that the pipe depends on the soil for support. And so if the pipe is failing, the soil has failed. And so geotechnical improvements are often going to be a part of a flexible pipe rehabilitation project. Invert fail in mild piping is common. There's a lot of published guidance that exists, very commoditized work to fix that invert erosion piece. And so, that's very common. But the buckling that we saw, right, where we got reverse curvature, the lifting where the bottom of the pipe is lifted up, and the crown deterioration is more complex. So technology selection and alternatives analysis, how are we going to fix this pipe? So I'm going to kind of march through the different technologies that we looked at and what included or precluded them or were challenges. So we looked at a slip lining, and a 3D LiDAR that we collected on this had multiple conflicts, right? So you can see clearly we had a cross-sectional conflict. We couldn't push through this. And also we had these bend angles that we wouldn't be able to push the sticks of pipe through, right, without needing to chop them up into very small segments so that we could lobster back through them and maintain the joint tolerance, which can be done, but is another risk. And there's also the challenge that the leading edge could get arrested on that undulating culvert of the corrugations or any of those lifted portions. So then we thought about liner plates. But that was precluded pretty early on, again because of capacity reduction. But a lot of custom work. We had these buckled lobes that we'd have to clear out of the way for the liner plate, which would involve the process like what's called spiling here, which I mean is you can see is pretty intense. You've got to ram these shoring pieces in and then excavate out the buckled portion while you're supporting it, and then push liner plate through it. So that was really unfavorable as well. CIPP was technically viable, but inexpensive. There'd be a lot of accommodations we need to make. You can't put in a pre-buckled CIPP liner. Well, I guess you could, but it wouldn't do much for you. So we would need to at least fill in those lobes, right? So these areas, so that we had at least something that didn't have any reverse curvature. We could design it, here that you can see in this with this orange shape here. We could design a liner that could be thick enough and reinforced enough to be structural even with that funky shape. But we'd have to fill in these lobes. And there was also these risks of blowout during inversion, which I've misspelled in the slide here, and now it's memorialized because I kept talking about how this is recorded. But there's risk of a blowout during inversion with a great slope. When you want to do a water inversion, that's a lot of hydrostatic head that you're putting at the end of that liner. So we'd have to do multiple insertion points so that we weren't putting that much head on the liner when we inverted it. And if we were going to do that, then we'd have to, if we wanted to move to air, then we'd still have to do multiple shots, because air shots are limited to what can be shipped in a refrigerated truck. And so then weight limits restrict on the highway, restrict how much they can ship. And then we also would still have to have non-styrenated resin. This project is located outside of Lake Tahoe, which is the most heavily regulated location in the universe. And so we'd have to use the green resin option, which would require a lot more air monitoring, treatment, capture, and disposal. So shotcrete was another one we looked at. It was the most versatile of the options. I mean, you're basically creating a reinforced concrete pipe, so the design can be pretty robust, and it arrives to the site in a bucket. But there was definitely a labor-intensive portion of this. It requires rigorous field QC and safety protocols to make sure that you get that what you're designing is actually what gets installed. And it's a time-intensive installation. But it does present the lowest risk to the owner in terms of a lot of this risk is then turned over to the contractor, right? It becomes their burden to make sure that it's designed as specified, and the risk is really borne by them. So forgive the obvious statement here, but our takeaway here is that all alternatives here presented significant risks for them. So for our case, the path to alternative delivery, I've got this kind of cute roadmap here showing the road here goes up to deciding if you want to do alternative delivery or if you take an off-ramp and go into conventional design bid build land. So first, if you have a prudent design, so engineering prudent from an engineering standpoint, so it's been tried and true, and it's fit for low bidding, almost, closer to commodity work, then you're in a design bid build situation. But if you need an innovative or cost saving design or a time savings design that you need a specific contractor commitment to make it work, you're probably still on the road for alternative delivery. The next kind of off-ramp is if your schedule is going to allow for a complete design and bidding phase where you think through all of the steps, you got to think through bidding strategy, put it out to bid, let the contractor prepare a response, all that needs to happen sequentially. If you have time, then it's probably another fit for a design bid build. If not, if you got a compressed schedule, and in this case we did for our project, they've got a very narrow construction window to accommodate basically between recreation seasons and heavy snows in Tahoe, then alternative delivery still looks appealing. And the last one is if you have an established and familiar contractor pool, you have to have the builders available who can actually do this work, right? And so if you've got many to pick from, you could be a good fit for design bid build. If not, if you're talking about a new or specialized technology or non-local providers, then you may want to look at alternative delivery to make sure that you get a qualified bidder. So in this case, we went through a CMGC contracting method, right? So after looking at all those technologies and realizing none of them were really ideal, we wanted to work with a contractor to pick which would be the most successful. Incline Village was our client. We had a contract line directly with them. We were going to be their engineer. We put out a bid, and then Q&D was interviewed by both us, by Jacobs and Incline Village. So we received packages from this contractor, interviewed them, and selected them. But Q&D's contract is directly to Incline Village. So there's no contract between us and Q&D. There's a dotted line. We're collaborating the whole time, but there's no hard contractual relationship between the two. So here's how we saw it worked on paper. This is again kind of restating that Richard Scarry cartoon. We designed something to a 30% level, outlining the alternatives and the requirements, put that out for advertisement. Contractors bid on it, and they would provide qualifications, approach, and then their estimated price with markups. You select them and you collaborate on the engineering and construction costs, and then you distribute risks and associated costs. And I'll talk about that in a minute. That's kind of an important part of this, this delivery method. Then you negotiate the final contract, including your key subs, right? So this is not something that the contractor doesn't take the bid and then go find subs to do it. Those key subs are identified ahead of time and a guaranteed maximum price. And then you execute and construct. You've got an open book schedule and earned value tracking. So that's that transparency that you have insight into throughout the project. So here I'm going to get into the technology piece of this, and this was a solution that the contractors proposed, and our role on the project was, to make sure that what they were proposing was, if they could do it, would it meet our engineering requirements, right? And so the arrangement here was that the contractor had the risk to make sure that this worked, and since they were proposing it and we were talking about it, it wouldn't be something that would fall back on Jacobs to say, well, you designed this, it wasn't possible. Well, no, the contractor said they could do this and wanted to know would it meet the requirements. So here's a cartoon that illustrates what they proposed. So I've got a profile here of the pipeline. So here is our conduit, and this is the embankment that's on top of it, and then it tapers out a little bit here. Then here's that large void. We had multiple of these, but here's probably the largest one that caused that buckled section in the culvert. So first was digging an excavation shaft outside the area of deepest embankment or an insertion pit. And then they would load in sticks of steel pipe, right? They'd load in a jacking frame. The red thing is a slip line jacking frame. And then they would drop in sticks of steel pipe, and they had welded on a conical head attachment on the front, kind of like a bursting head to re-round and also keep the pipe from hitting those obstructions that were on the bottom, but to lift it up and let it ride on top of the undulations. And then they would advance the pipe through the area portions that it could with the jacking frame. So they'd start just slip lining it. So it's slip lining, right, part of the slip burst ram. But then if the forces that they encountered when they came to this buckled section were too great, they would load in a pipe ram. So if you're familiar, a pipe ram is usually used for new trenchless installations. It's an extremely powerful machine that does what it says. It rams the pipe, and usually is meant to ram it through total soil. In this case, we're ramming it through an obstruction here with an attempt to re-round past the section. So the pipe ram will literally force it through out the other end, and push this soil up. Then after the fact, we would come back in and grout the annulus, and then we would drill grouting ports and do soil grouting on the outside to fill that grout, right? We still need to address that void that's there, and then come back in and do a cementitious lining on the entire thing for corrosion protection. So this has never been done before, and this is not something that we typically as an engineer would say, yes, contractor, go do something that's never been done before. There's a whole pantheon of liability that's invoked by that. But what's unique about this procurement method is that this was something that the contractor brought forward, and so the risk was on them to make sure that this could succeed. And our role was to evaluate and and help them identify, well, have they characterized the geotech enough? Would this steel pipe, is it thick enough, and would the cement be enough for corrosion protection after the pipe was installed? So here's how you handle risks in this kind of delivery method. So, there's the uncertainties in the construction approaches. There's productivity rates, right, that might be affected by wind, weather, or weather and other things. Site conditions, things that you may or may not have characterized as detailed as you like or could. And then extra work, things always come up, right? You quantify those risks, both in terms of probability and cost. We do this all the time from a condition assessment standpoint. In this context, you do it from a construction standpoint. What's the probability and the cost of all these risks? And then you balance the risk tolerance between all parties, right? You evaluate the risk versus the reward or the price. And then you've got owner-controlled versus contractor-controlled allocations. So these are things where, if certain risks are encountered, the owner gets to arbitrate whether or not the contractor can dip into those risk monies to resolve it. And other things are the things that the contractor says that they're going to be able to control and say, they're going to be the ones that make the determination. And then you set aside these weighted contingency budgets for the remaining risks. So here's what I'll share. This is an example, and I've even got watermarked on the back. It says big example there. And what I want to point out here is this is that transparency piece. I can't share with you what our actual risk register was for this project. That was one of the things that was confidential because there's a lot of insight into how that contractor is set up. And so there's just a risk that if that could be made to their competitors, that they could then be, tactfully outbid in projects. But what I can share with you is that these risks, the scale, what I've listed here on the left-hand column, that's exactly the type of risk that was talked about. What's the risk of a bypass overflow? What's the risk that you might actually need internal spiling? What at the time there were tariffs that were going on? What's the risk that that steel costs would go up? And these are, the potential costs here. These are not the ones from the project, but they're about the right order of magnitude. There were many risks that were identified, and they're all given scales, in this magnitude: 10,000, 90,000, 50,000, and then a probability, right? An estimated probability that's agreed upon, and then a weighted contingency. So those are the weighted contingencies, cost times probability, that go off into a special war chest that can be tapped by the contractor or the owner, depending on the circumstances as the project evolves. So with that, armed with this delivery method, here we're getting to the eye candy of the construction. So the first thing they did was bypass the culvert. They used rubber dams. You can kind of see them here, but they redirected the culvert through HDPE pipe. They put these rubber dams in and then an HDPE pipe that pumped the water around. And then here's the downstream end. You can see that they've got a diffuser that comes up, and then the water poured out. And so that's the downstream end of the culvert. They dug the insertion pit, so you can see they went to the one open area that they did have access to, put in the trench boxes and bedding. And then here's the welding of the rounding head under the top. You can see it's got this conical shape here to re-round, and then it's reinforced on the inside.
We can't see what you're presenting.
Yeah, so I've heard this is an issue before with Teams. What I can just offer is that if you can't see it, it is all being recorded, and I apologize. It's a Teams limitation. I've heard of this happening, but the content is shared and is recorded. So thanks for sharing, and I'll have to work through TAC to see how we can get that problem fixed. So here's the attachment of the rounding head. In the lower left-hand screen, you can see you can barely see it out in the shadow here, but I want to show that there was bracing that they actually welded in. So to make sure that this rounding head, because it was going to see some pretty hard stresses, the rounding head wouldn't get buckled and compromised. And then, using a crane and lifting and putting the lead pipe into the trench. Here's the operation of the jackring frame, just like a regular slip lining operation, and completing of the first insertion. Now, as they drop in each new steel sticks of pipe, they had to do welds, and we did complete joint penetration welds. So it took a while to get that kind of welding done on each of the sticks, but it was important, right? You did not want these sticks getting separated inside the trench when they were seeing that much resistant force. And then success, right? The rounding head emerged at the downstream end. You can see, some of the scrape marks here, but overall, the bracing did its job of re-rounding the pipe and getting the steel through. What I also want to mention is that not only was there a re-rounding issue, but this alignment wasn't straight. I showed those bends and curves, so they weren't just re-rounding it from a cross-sectional point of view, they were kind of straightening the pipe as they ran this steel pipe through. So that was the other thing that's important to take note of. And then we did the annular space grouting. So they drilled holes, they did grout injection, and then afterwards they prepped the surface and went through with a centrifugally applied cementitious liner for corrosion protection on the inside. So my lessons learned here, the CMGC model really enabled innovations that would otherwise impart too much risk, primarily to the owner, and too much risk to us as the engineer, that you might see if you wanted to go in a conventional low bid process. Doing something that was the first of its kind ever, and would essentially put, this, if we were to design this and say, do this first of a kind burst split ram and put a steel pipe through a collapsed and curved section, I mean, if we were to put out a specification like that, that's a ton of risk on us, right? The contractor could say, I did what you said and it didn't work. But the CMGC model really put that risk back on the contractor if they felt that they could get it and get a savings, and then could reward them, right? This project saved over $1 million compared to the other alternatives, and the contractor could share in that. The open book costing and scheduling is confidential outside the parties involved. So everybody that's on the job, you have a view of, you can be assured of transparency, but it may complicate value comparisons between your other regions or projects, especially when it comes to us as consultants who have a hand in it. Because this is confidential, we can't. It's not always an easy one-to-one to say, is CMGC the right model to use, because some of this financial information is confidential. And then from a technical standpoint, this was a great project. It worked out well, but I just want to say that, you're not going to see a master spec for this kind of approach showing up in our library anytime soon. I think there's a lot more research needed to see, what are the limits of this approach, right? For re-rounding buckled and curved alignments. And we used a pretty stout steel pipe. Did we need to, right? More research to see could there even be a potentially thinner steel shells or casings that could be re-rounded by this approach. So with that, I think I've got 4 minutes for questions. Again, I apologize for those who can't see the screen. Say again, it is recorded, so we can always go back and look. But I got a few minutes for questions.